So this session is titled Moving Application Data to the Cloud, and you may remember that in the first session we have assessed the database migration. We have seen that we had a couple of services that were not supported on Azure SQL Database, but we decided to move on with the migration anyway because we can live with that. And if you cannot live with that, on the other hand, you have always an alternative, which is Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, so you will see what are the particularities, the specificities of this solution. So we already saw this slide, but I just want to go through one thing quickly here. Specifically for data, one important migration driver can be if you have an acquisition in mind, like if you have been acquired or you have acquired a firm, because very often firms use different data systems. Like for example, they could be using MySQL and you are using PostgreSQL. They might be using NoSQL with Cosmos DB or even with MongoDB, and you are using SQL database with SQL Server, for example. And so on Azure, you have the possibility to integrate those solutions easily because we have those as a service. You can run them as a service, and then you can easily connect them, for example, with some express route or even with some software, and maybe building a quick application, a quick function, and things like that. So again, right, many migration drivers, many reasons why you want to drive and to go to the cloud. But if you want to go back more in detail, go back to the first session where I explained all that. The migration journey, all right, we have seen that we have those 4 different stages, and the assessment was inside the first session. The last session, just before this one, we have done the migration of the web application to app service, and now in here we are going to go to migrating the data itself, and we'll also talk about optimizing the data and seeing how you can optimize your cost, your performance, your security. All right, so moving on to this session. This session, we are going to, first of all, recap a little bit what Azure Migrate can bring you, and then we are going to meet a few tools that can help you with the migration because we have multiple tools that can help you with the migration. And then we'll talk about data solutions on Azure. We have a lot of different ways to host data, be it relational data, non-relational data, or structured, semi-structured, these kind of things. Then we'll talk about migrating the SQL database itself. This icon here is the one of the database migration service. This is a new tool that I will introduce, and then we'll do the migration itself in the demo. And then we'll talk about optimizing the services, not just for cost, but also for performance and security. And then we'll talk about Azure Storage because data comes in multiple forms, multiple shapes. Maybe you have relational, non-relational, but maybe you also have, amorphous data which doesn't have a specific shape, unstructured data, and that can be, for example, images, videos, it could be PDF files. The PDF file per se has a structure. When you open it, you see text, but in terms of the binary file that is hosting it, it doesn't have a relation, it doesn't have a structure. And we have solutions for you to host that, for example, in Azure Storage. So let's talk about the migration tools, and I told you already that we are going to work here mostly with the database migration service, which is a very managed and very versatile tool, but we also have other tools, and so I wanted quickly to mention to you where you can get started. So one good place to get started is on the web, and here we have the Azure Database Migration Guide. This is a place where you can select different sources and different targets, and you see that we even support Access, for example, and please don't chuckle because I often get this question in conferences. People ask me, well, I do have an Access database, I've been using Access for many years, I would like to move that to Azure, is there a way? And definitely we have migration solutions here. So here you can go and say, all right, I want to get started from DB2, from Oracle, from Cassandra, etc., etc. And then we will show you the different targets that you have that you can use and the different tools that can help you to do that. Another tool specifically for SQL Server as a target It's the SQL Server Migration Assistant. And here again, you can migrate from Access, from DB2, from MySQL, from SAP to SQL Server on-premise, but also to Azure SQL Database single instance. And so that can be a very, very interesting scenario if you have some migrations that you want to do pretty quick. However, I would say we this day recommend to use the database migration service whenever possible, because it is really a managed migration tools, and even for very large solutions, very large workloads, then you can use that, and then that's going to work just fine. So before we do the migration itself, I would like to talk about different data solutions on Azure, because you need a target for your data. You need to know what exists so that you can even host your data. And the first one I want to mention is Azure Cosmos DB. This is really like the crown of the jewel, or the jewel of the crown rather, that you can use in Azure. It's a NoSQL database. It's very, very powerful. In fact, a lot of Microsoft and a lot of Azure run on Cosmos DB, so we are definitely using it for us as well. It is a globally distributed database, and I know you're going to tell me, well, Azure SQL Database is also globally distributed in the sense that I can select a secondary database, and that's going to be used for backup. And you can even read with certain data plans, you can even read from this secondary database, and this is true. But Azure Cosmos DB was thought really from the ground up as a globally distributed database. And for example, you have the possibility not just to read from different locations, but even to write to different locations. And then after that, you will have replication happening, and you have different consistency models that you can choose from. For example, you could say, I don't know, I want to write the data and come back to my application as fast as possible, but then I know that I will need a little bit of time for the data to be replicated worldwide. Or you can say, no, I want when my application, when the request comes back to my application, I want to know that the data has been already replicated. So you have those 5 different models that you can choose from. Of course, you have the possibility to scale out and scale in easily. You can configure that very easily. We guarantee a few things. This is what SLA means, service level agreement. We have things like low latency, below 10 milliseconds for read and for write, so it is very low. We have things like high availability, and in fact, I want to say very high availability, 99.999%. But for the developer, what's also interesting is that you can host your data in multiple shapes. For example, key value or column family or document DB or graph. And we have also different APIs allowing you to access this data, meaning that if you have an existing application, for example with MongoDB, you can migrate your data to Cosmos DB with a Mongo API, and then you barely need to change your application. You just need to change the connection string. Similarly with Gremlin, Cassandra, and you can even access the data, the document DB, with SQL commands, which for a NoSQL database is kind of funny, but it really does work, and so that gives you really a great flexibility. Now, another thing I want to mention is the Azure database for open source database engine. Now, those open source database engines are very, very popular, especially PostgreSQL. But think about MySQL. This is the M in the LAMP stack, okay, the Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. So this is a very, very popular solution. We also have MariaDB, which is a community fork of MySQL with additional features and community driven. Those open source databases are very efficient, they are very performant, they are also quite cheap to run. And the cool thing is that if you migrate those to Azure, then you get all the benefits of Azure, things like automated backups, the patching of the database engine so that you don't have to worry about it yourself, monitoring because it's going to participate in the global monitoring solutions with Azure Monitor, security. All right. So you really have a lot of advantages in doing that. It's pretty much the best of both worlds if you want. You have your open source database, but you also have the versatility and the flexibility and the power of Azure. Now, Azure SQL Database, this is what we are going to be migrating in this particular session. A few takeaways around that. Azure SQL Database is a fully managed platform as a service. So it is a platform-oriented alternative to running SQL Server in a VM. All right, you have a lot of advantages around that. We guarantee 99.99% availability, so it has a high availability. And then it is based on SQL Server technology, which means that if you have a tool that you know and love, for example, SQL Server Management Studio, SQL Command, the Azure Data Studio, or even Visual Studio for that matter, you can access Azure SQL Database over some well-known APIs and well-known SDKs. So it is quite consistent. Now it comes originally by default in two different versions, single database, which means that you have one server with multiple databases and each database has a set of resources that it's going to use. Or you can also select, you can add your database to what we call an elastic pool. Elastic pool means that the resources are going to be shared. And for example, let's imagine that you have a scenario where you have two databases, one with a product description for your website and one which is used for reporting. Typically, during the day, you're going to need a lot of power for the product description and for this database, which is driving your e-commerce website. But then in the night, maybe you want to run some analytics on your reports, and maybe you want to give more power to this other database, a reporting database. This is the kind of scenario that you can use. And I want also to mention that the database can be taken in and out of an elastic pool at any time, so you have also flexibility here. Of course, we have full monitoring and alerting capacity. We can let you know when there is a problem with your database, either from a security standpoint, from a performance standpoint, or even from an availability standpoint, so that you always know what's happening. Now, I mentioned that Azure SQL Database single instance is based on SQL Server. It's true. One thing which is nice with it is that it is very cost-effective to run, but on the other hand, we don't have 100% capacity with SQL Server. So if you are using certain options of SQL Server, I don't know, for example, things like compiled CLR or cross-database joins, which are not currently supported on Azure SQL Database, then Azure SQL Database Managed Instance might be a good solution for you. And maybe you remember when we did the assessment in the first session, I selected Azure SQL Database single instance as a target because I know it's cost effective, but I told you that if the two features that were deemed incompatible were causing issues, then maybe I could upgrade to an Azure SQL Database Managed Instance instead. So what is Azure SQL Database Managed Instance? It's a new flavor of SQL Database if you want, running on Azure. It is also a fully managed service. It's a platform as a service, so it's not SQL Server on a VM, okay? It's really something that is running as platform as a service. It has the same infrastructure as SQL Database, so you can use the same tools. But in addition, you have this increased compatibility, almost 100% compatibility with SQL Server running on-premise. So essentially, you could say it's SQL Server in the cloud, all right? Now, in addition to the added compatibility, you also have full isolation and security. So it is clearly an enterprise-grade solution where you have a private virtual network, you have private IP addresses, no public IP addresses. You can connect to it using ExpressRoute or VPN. And so, for example, you can have a scenario where you have a VNet, you have your database on it, it's fully private, nobody can access the data except possibly an application service, a web application, for example, which then has port 80 exposed, and every access to the database runs through the application so that you have additional control over what's going on. So that's quite a nice thing. Now, of course, with all those features, Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, it's an enterprise grade solution. It is more expensive than Azure SQL Database single instance. The cost, however, is transparent. It's easy to see if you want to add more features, more CPUs, etc., how much it's going to cost, and it is competitive as well. All right, so let's talk about the demo. I'm going to show you how we are going to create the Azure SQL Database first, how we can configure it, and then later we'll do the migration itself. So I'm going to go into the Azure portal, and as always, everything I do in the Azure portal can be done also, for example, with Cloud Shell, with command line interaction, etc. Let's go into the marketplace. Here you see that in the popular section, we have SQL Database. We have also some demos, some docs, some tutorials, some quick starts. So basically, we really take you by the hand and we teach you how to do this. Let's go and select SQL Managed Instance because I want to show you how you can create one if you need one at some point. So as you can see, this is a resource like any other in Azure, all right? You're going to have a few things to configure. Note that it's not running in every region at the moment, so you need to make sure that you select a region in which this database, this service is actually available. For example, Western Europe, Western US, Eastern US, Northern Europe, etc., or of course in Southeast Asia as well. So that's good to know that you need to be careful about that. Here, if I go and select, for example, Western Europe, you see that I have it. You have, of course, different configurations that you can use. For now, I'm not going to need that. I'm going to go to a single instance SQL database. And here I have the subscription and the resource group just like before. I'm going to enter a database name for that. Now, of course, the database name needs to follow certain rules. You're going to be checked as you go, so it's going to be validated, all right? And then I'm going to select a server. At the moment, I don't have a SQL server, so I'm going to create a new one. And then later, remember that you could have multiple databases per server. The name needs to be unique, all right? So again, it is validated as you type. I'm going to add my initials in front. And then I'm going to enter a SQL Server admin login with username and password, all right? And eventually, I'm going to select the region for the server because, again, you have a choice here, and I'm going to put it in Western Europe so that it is close from my application service that I migrated in the previous session. Here, I could select to use Elastic Pool if I wanted to, but here I can also scale up and scale down. And the good thing to know is that you can at any time scale up and scale down. Notice that you also have a Hyperscale solution. If you have some really high volumes of data, you can use that. Now, once you migrate into Hyperscale, you cannot migrate out of it. But you see that here I have a very cost-effective solution where I'm going to pay an estimated $15 per month. So for this small application, it's quite attractive. The networking, just want to show you that I'm going to configure no access at all for the moment. We'll talk about the firewall a little bit later. And here you have advanced data security that you can configure. We'll do that later. And I'll explain to you more about advanced data security just a little bit later. So here the deployment is in progress. Like always on Azure, it's taking a few minutes. Here we go a little bit faster. When the resource is available, we can go into the dashboard, all right? And as you can see, this is a database dashboard, not the server dashboard. This is really the database here. I have different connection strings, all right? ADO.NET, JDBC, ODBC, PHP, Go, so you have different ways to access it. And now let me show you the advanced data security that we talked about. Now this is an additional cost of $15 per server per month. All right, this is per server, not per database. And it's really good because for $15 you're going to have peace of mind. We are going to run some assessments on a regular basis, all right? And it's going to show you vulnerabilities. For example, here, notice that I have one high-risk vulnerability. Immediately after creating the database, it says you should enable audit at the server level, which is probably a good advice. Now, we're also going to run scans on your data. For example, if you have things like SQL injection or if you have unusual login activity, we are going to notify you. So that's really good to know. Let's go to the server now. Okay, this is a server which is hosting the database. At the moment, I just have one database here. And here I have the possibility to go and configure the firewall because right now it's totally blocked. Nobody can access this server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow other Azure services and resources to access this server, meaning that if it's running on Azure on the same virtual network, it will have access to the server, which is the case of my web application. So that's good to know. All right, we can go back to the database. Let's go up. And now I want to show you that you can see the data directly in your web browser. You can, of course, use another tool like SQL Server Management Studio if you prefer. But one thing is that here I'm going to be denied access as expected because my client, which is really my laptop, that's the IP address of my laptop, doesn't go through the firewall. So let's go and add the client IP to the firewall rules. Okay, this is my current laptop IP. I'm going to save that. And then once this is saved, we are going to go back to the query editor and now we can log in. Of course, at this time, the database is empty. There are no tables because we didn't migrate yet. But basically, at this point, we are ready for the migration. So let's talk about the migration itself and let's talk about the Azure Database Migration Service. Now, this is a very powerful tool, very nice to use as well, very easy to use and convenient. And you're going to be able to migrate from different sources to different targets. For example, you see that we support SQL Server as a source running inside your premise or inside AWS. And then for the target, for SQL Server on-premise, we have Azure SQL DB, Azure SQL DB managed instance, or even Azure SQL running in a virtual machine, all right? For Oracle, we support a migration path to Azure Database for PostgreSQL. DB2 into SQL DB. MongoDB, that's a NoSQL solution. You can run it into Azure Cosmos DB with Mongo API, for example. And like this, you have a migration path, and then you can just switch a connection string. You don't need to modify your application. And even those open source databases, MySQL running in AWS, PostgreSQL running in AWS, and then we have after that the target for the corresponding Azure database, for example, MySQL or PostgreSQL. All right, so the database migration service is what we are going to use in the demo to do the migration. So let's go back to our portal, all right? And in this portal, we are going to create a new resource, and this is going to be the database migration service, DMS for short. Let's go and create it. As always, you have some tutorials and everything here. Now you can select the name of the migration service and you can select the configuration. We are going to take a premium configuration because it's going faster and it doesn't cost anything for 6 months. So it's really good. All right. We are going to enter a name for the DMS, a region, and here I'm not going to do that because creating the DMS takes a certain number of minutes, and I already created one, so I'm going to go back into my resource group. You see the one I created is right here. It is empty, okay? I didn't start to do any migration at this point, so we are going to start by creating a new migration project. What is a project? Is essentially a source to target pair, and then you can have multiple activities on this project. So let's give it a name, rewards mig, all right? I'm going to select the source server type, and so again, we have here all the sources and then later all the targets that you can select. For example, if I select MongoDB, I can choose Cosmos DB with MongoDB API as a target. If I select something like SQL Server running on AWS, you have a path. Oracle, we have a path. And you also have those open source databases, PostgreSQL, MySQL. And so here, if I select, for example, PostgreSQL, I can migrate to Azure Database for PostgreSQL as a choice. So we have quite a lot of different choices, but here we want really to migrate a SQL Server. And so let's go and select SQL Server as a source. And then for the target, here I would have Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, or SQL Database running on a virtual machine in Azure. So those are the different migration paths that we have. Now we are going to select the type of activity. And here, the SQL migration is a two-step migration where we are going to start by migrating the schema first. So we are just going to migrate the table definition, all right? So now I have my project ready, and then I'm going to create a new activity. And this activity, of course, I need to configure it. So I need to say, all right, what is the source of the data? So let's enter the name of the virtual machine where it's running right now. Then I'm going to select SQL authentication, username, and password, all right? And then when this is done, the DMS is going to try to connect to the source database. And if he can do that, we are going to select the target. So this is the target. I have the server name right here in the dashboard. Let's go and copy it, all right? And then after that, I'm also going to enter here the authentication. Username is Tailwind, password is secret, of course. Here we go. Then again, the DMS is going to try to connect to the target. And when this is done, we are going to say which database we want to migrate. Okay. And then we create the activity. So this activity is about migrating the schema only. So we call it mig schema, for example. I'm going to run the migration. This is a very small database. You remember it has just like two tables, sorry. So this is really small. So it's going to take a short time, but if you have a big database, it's just going to take longer, but everything is going to run in exactly the same manner. So we can just refresh quickly. We see that it is completed now. Perfect. Let's go back into the DMS, and I'm going inside the same project to create a new activity. Now here we have the choice between online data migration and offline data migration. So this is important to understand what is the difference. Now, online data migration is great to avoid any downtime into your application. And so here is the explanation. If you have a web application, it's going to write to the source SQL server. Then you want to do the migration. What you do is you switch off the web application for the moment, and then you do the migration, switch the connection string. But during the downtime, you have lost some customers because they went to the competition and they probably never come back because your website was down. So with the online migration, what's going to happen is that you don't need the downtime. You're going to do the migration to the target Azure SQL Database, all right? During this time or after this time, if users are continuing to write to the old source, this is going to be updating the target. And like this, when you're ready, when you have run all your tests, you can switch the connection string, and then only you can discard the old source SQL server because you don't need it anymore. Now here, for the demo, I'm using a offline migration because it goes faster, but remember that you have the possibility to do an online migration as well. All right, so now we are logged into the source and the target. We have the database selected. We could set the source database to read-only if we wanted to. All right, I'm going to select the tables. Tables have been migrated, so this is good. And now I can go. One thing I want to note at this point is that you have the possibility to scale up to an additional, to a more powerful SQL server. And that's really nice on Azure that you can do that. And then after the migration, you can scale back down to save money. But during the migration like this, you have more DTU or you have more power so that the migration runs faster. So it's good to know that you can do that. Now we are ready to run the migration. All right. Just like before, it's going to take a very short time here because this is a very small database. But if you have a large database, you can also migrate it in exactly the same manner. The only difference is really that it's just going to take longer. All right. Now we have migrated the data. So we can go and check if everything seems to have been migrated okay. All right. Let's go to the connection string. We are going to copy that. And then we will go back to the application. But remember, the connection string in the previous session, we didn't save it in the web application. We saved it in Key Vault because we do things in a very managed manner, in a very nice manner. So we have this connection string in Key Vault. And in Key Vault, I cannot simply go and change the connection string. This is the old version of the connection string. What I can do, however, is create a new version of the connection string. So let's go because everything is audited, everything is kept. So I'm going to go here. This is a name. This is a new value. All right, let's paste what we just copied. Now in this connection string, the password is actually not set yet. So I'm going to quickly open here or rather visualize the connection string. We are going to find the password and we are going to replace it with the correct password. By the way, this database doesn't exist anymore, so don't even try to connect to it. All right, now we have a new identifier for the version of the connection string, so I'm going to take it. We can go back to our web application, which is here, and then in the configuration, if you remember, we had this syntax at Microsoft.KeyVault. And so this allows me to access the Key Vault value without having to use an SDK. So this is here the old value. I'm going to use the new identifiers that I just copied. And here is the famous syntax at Microsoft.KeyVault and then the secret URI, which means that the developers don't see the connection strings. They don't need to. We have a trusted team with role-based access control who can manage those secrets. All right, so now we are updating the configuration, and if you go here and resubmit the form, for example, we see that everything works the same way as before, which means that we have performed the migration, the data has been migrated, we can totally go and switch off the old database because we don't need it anymore. Let's quickly check in the query editor, we see our tables. We can see here all the different columns, and if I run a quick query, for example, select star from customers, and then run this. We see it's a little bit small here on the screen, but we see that the data has been obtained. So basically everything runs fine, and now we are fully running on Azure, which means that we are ready to optimize the services, and that will be the next step in this presentation. So now that our application has been ported to the cloud, it's a good time to optimize the service. And really, I want you to think when the application is running great, when the customers are happy, this is a great time for you to pause and see how you can make it even better, how you can optimize security, of course, but also performance. And of course, at the end, also optimize your cost, because this is what you want. You want to serve your customers with excellence, but you also want to pay less for it, obviously, right? So optimizing the services, there are different things that you can do. Let's start with security. That's really the first in line. And again, like I mentioned in the first session, this is a business as usual activity. You should always be optimizing your security. The very first thing you should do is at the database level and at the server level, you should have firewall rules. And if you remember the demo, we closed everything at first. Nobody had access to this database. And then after that, we opened for other Azure services, for example, the app service, which is going to access the data. And then we also added one IP address for my own client for my laptop, so that I could access it using the query editor or using, of course, other tools such as SQL Server Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, etc. So firewalls, very important. If you feel that the firewall at the database and at the server level are not enough, you can also secure your virtual network, for example, with network security groups, with other firewalls, and so you can have really a layered approach to security. Azure Active Directory, super important. Okay, right now we are using a SQL login with username and password, but why not use Azure Active Directory instead? And why not give an identity to your applications and allow them to access other services? Or maybe you also want to have role-based access control for access to the management of your database. So this is really also a good place to go. And finally, advanced data security. I showed you quickly how you can configure it. It's going to run all the time. It's going to check your data. It's going to warn you if something is bad, and it's going to give you peace of mind. Performance of your queries, all right, this is something that you can totally optimize using our tools. And of course, queries are what takes a long time in your data, okay, in the handling of your data. The application is going to access the data, and here you have access, you have an insight into DTU consumption. This is important because at the end, this is what you're going to pay, all right? But also things like CPU usage, the duration of a query, and how many times the query is executed. And for example, you can say, all right, I want to optimize the queries that last the longer, or I want to optimize the queries that are called the most often, all right, something like that. You can really totally drill into the details, get more information about what's taking a long time. And we're also going to give you some recommendations on how you can actually accelerate those queries, how you can make them run faster. And if you choose to do so, we can even do some of the work automatically for you. So this is the address where you can get more information about the SQL Query Performance Analyzer. And really, I recommend that you look into it because it's a great way to make your customers happy. Also, some information about SQL tuning your database, tuning your SQL Server for more performance. As for cost, of course, this is super interesting for you because this is what you're going to do to pay less. And here we have the Azure Cost Management Center. Now, this is going to give you always a breakdown of what your spending is at the moment, and also an estimation of your spending for the coming few days until the end of the month. So it's a good place to spend some time. We are also going to give you some recommendation on how you can optimize your spendings into the cloud. And by the way, I'm not sure if you know already, but if you don't know about it, if you have SQL Server licenses for your on-premise servers, you can actually leverage those in the cloud. This is what we call the Azure Hybrid benefit. And you also have Azure Reserved instances, which are going to give you more flexibility on how you utilize your resources, and also which are going to save you quite a lot of money. So definitely interesting to check. This is going, of course, to bring more value to your application on the long term. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is the type of storage, all right? Because you have different type of storage, you have different data solutions on Azure. So we talked already about structured data, relational data, for example, the product description, all right? You have different tables and those tables have relations, and this is great for SQL. But maybe you have what I would call some semi-structured data. And for example, think about the shopping cart. Shopping carts are very simple to use. All right, you have one object where you have all the data, and then you want to pretty much serialize this object to storage, and you want this to go as fast as possible with as much security as possible, and possibly even be replicated worldwide. Like this, you will have a faster write access to the shopping cart. So this is a good use case for Cosmos DB. But you also have another type of data, and this is the unstructured data, okay, the blobs, what we call blobs, binary large objects. And here that could be pictures, videos, PDF, any type of binary files really. And for this we also have solutions, and this is Azure Storage. So let's go into Azure Storage services. We have quite a lot of services. Some of them I would say are closer to infrastructure as a service, things like disks, all right? Your virtual machines need disks, and here we have the possibility to manage them. You have HDDs, SSDs, etc. But you also have files, and files can be interesting for a legacy scenario. Let's imagine that you have a file share on your server and your users are, saving files to it. You can easily migrate that to the cloud to a file service in Azure Storage, and then after that you also have access via SMB, even encrypted SMB, so the SMB protocol, which is used by Windows Explorer or by other solutions on other platforms. And like this, you can access very easily your cloud file share from Windows Explorer on your local machine, and then you have basically lifted and shifted your application. Now on the platform as a service side, it is still Azure Storage, still the same service. You have blobs, and we'll come back to blobs because this is where we are going to spend a little bit more time. You also have tables and queues. Tables are non-relational tables. It's a very simple key value way of storing things. You can have massive data into there, so it's quite interesting. You also have dynamic scaling. It can scale up to petabytes of data. Queues are more for messaging. It's like a first in, first out messaging system, quite interesting. So let's talk about blobs. Blobs are binary large objects. You can access all the Azure Storage services via REST, all right? So we have APIs for that. We also have SDKs for different languages, .NET of course, but also Java, JavaScript, etc. And everything is built on a unified storage system. So you have resiliency, you have encryption at rest, all right? You have also the replication, which is strongly consistent. This is all working in the same manner. Load balancing, fault tolerance, etc. Blobs, we have different tiers. That's quite interesting. You can have a hot tier, like a hot container, which is reacting very fast with minimal latency. But you can also have a cool tier. And so typically what we observe is that files are accessed a lot in the first few days that they are stored. But then after that, the usage tends to go down. And maybe that's a good time where you want to move this data to a cool storage tier because it's going to be a lot less expensive. Now you will have a little bit more latency, but you will also save a lot of money. So the hot tier for the beginning, after that the cool tier. And if you do backups, all right, those are large data files that you access. Ideally, you never want to access them. Sometimes you need to access them. Then you can copy that to an archive tier. An archive tier is very, very cheap. Of course, the latency there is going to be way bigger. All right, it can take really a long time to restore those files. So you need to be a little bit careful with that. But it is a good place to store data that you want to keep for a very long time. So we'll spend a little bit more time in the blob service here. And let's see a demo on how you can migrate big files to Azure Storage. And in that case, the files that we are going to migrate are not really huge. They are image data that we have in our web application. So this is a web application here. And this one is actually another web application. It is a Tailwind Traders e-commerce website. This is a very, very critical part of our infrastructure. And this is a website here that you can see. And if we go down to the categories, you see that we have a lot of images. And right now, those images are actually stored inside the web server itself. This is how we used to do things back then. But it's not great because it means they are probably to end up into source control. And here you see, for example, this image comes from /product detail, which is a folder inside the web server. So they probably go into source control. It's not great. Now here, this application is quite good because we have actually a setting where we can specify where the images come from. You see that they come from /product detail in this case. So what we are going to do now is take those images and we are going to move them into Azure storage, because like this we'll have a CDN, all right, content delivery network. By the way, if we use a console, I don't know if you know that, but there is also a console in App Service in the portal directly, so we can navigate to the folder and see all the files. This is quite convenient directly in the web browser. So let's go into the Azure Storage Explorer. You can use different tools to do that, also directly in the portal if you want. I'm going to create a new blob container. And then one thing you shouldn't forget is set the public access level. So now I'm going to say if I have a URL for a blob, I can access it in an anonymous manner. But I need the URL for the blob. So this is what we are going to be constructing in the application. Those are the images of the website. I'm just going to upload them using the Azure Storage Explorer. Again, I have multiple tools to do that. I could use also the portal if I want, or there is also AZ copy. And now I'm copying the unique URL for one of those blobs, because each one of those blobs has a unique URL. And now if I go into the configuration, into the product images URL setting, I can replace this local folder with the URL of the container where those blobs are located. All right, I can save that. The application is going to restart. It is actually going to be seamless, so that's cool. After a short wait, we can go back to the website, refresh, and now we are going to see that the image is still there. It is running fine. But this time, if I select it, we see that it is coming from my Azure Blob storage. And like this, I can go back to my web server. I can delete those images. I can copy also other big files, for example, videos, etc., etc. And I optimize my cost because Azure storage is much less expensive than the service plan for sure. And maybe I can even downgrade to a smaller service plan if I want to. So it's good to know that you can do that. So let's review what we learned in this session. We saw quite a few components. First of all, we of course talked about Azure Migrate again, because this is really the hub where we are spending most time. All right, we saw also other tools for the migration. We talked about data solutions. All right, NoSQL, SQL, open source databases running on Azure Database. Then we did the migration using the database migration service, which is our managed migration tool. Then we optimized. First of all, we talked about optimizing the security, but we also talked about costs and about performance. And then I showed you how you can take different types of data, such as unstructured data, and move it to Azure storage instead, so that you have really a complete overview of the data solutions. So hopefully this session was useful for you. This is now where you can learn more, because you should always keep learning. aka.ms/mod30, and in there you will find links to tutorials, samples, module on Microsoft Learn, because Microsoft Learn is really where you can continue learning. So hopefully this was a helpful session for you.